All right, and for our final keynote of this year's SFLIG, we have two speakers, Dr. Lucy Macnaught and Dr. Ruth French, who will be talking about using ideational convergence to create accessible classroom meta-language. So Dr. Lucy Macnaught is a senior lecturer and learning advisor at Auckland University of Technology. Her book, Writing with Students, New Perspectives on Collaborative Writing in EAP Context, is currently shortlisted for the MAK Halliday Book Prize. It illuminates how meta-language and the organization of classroom talk enable students to critique and justify their choices and teachers to guide but not, to justify their choices and teachers to guide but not provide wording. Okay. Additional research interests include Gen AI for writing development and embedding academic literacy in coursework and research programs. Dr. Ruth French is lecturer in the School of International Studies and Education at the University of Technology in Sydney. Her research interest, University of Technology Sydney, excuse me. Her research and teaching interests include language and literacy education, children's literature, primary curriculum and pedagogy, and a particular interest is the development of children's knowledge about language, including grammar. Professors, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou and a warm welcome from Auckland.
And hello from Darug and Gundungurra country in the Blue Mountains in Australia.
Our thanks to the organisers for this wonderful opportunity to connect and to all of you for the precious gift of your time. We'd like to start by inviting you to think about the last slide deck you created, perhaps for this conference, maybe for something else, or if you don't want to think about your own work, perhaps think about someone else's, and bring to mind a slide or two, perhaps one you thought was really good, and think about what was on the slide in terms of the color and shape and how that might be working with wording in some way. So just silently reflect, and I'll give you a few seconds. So holding those beautiful thoughts, we'd like to invite you to critique or just actually react to a commercial resource that we'll show you in a moment. A little bit of context, it's for grade 3 students. And at this point, we welcome any reactions you might have in chat. Even just a word would be great. So when you're ready, here is the resource. So Connie is pink. She stands for a type of language feature. There's a pyramid that's doing something with arranging connectives in there. And there's a color gradient being used. And anyone else got any just gut reactions to what you think of this resource? Someone says Connie confused. Maybe, okay. So any thoughts that you may be having? Yeah, and VCOP, thanks, Pauline. Most frequent one at the top. Okay, you're starting to see some logic. Too many words in the pyramid. The relationships aren't clear in the pyramid. Okay, so we want to move, and our job today is really to take the kind of immediate reactions you're having and going, all right, how can we use some theory to understand options that might be taken or not taken here? And we're going to come back to cool Connie and the connectives at the end, and we'll critique what's there and not there. And these choices in this resource, the VCOP, Pauline, is this. We see similar kinds of choices being made. Color, things in pyramids, organized in some way. And we've cared in our tradition of SFL about the meta-language we use with students for a very long time. We recently dug up and revisited a resource from 1990, to share a little bit of it with you. You may notice some familiar faces there, perhaps with hairdos that aren't familiar, and in some cases with hair. Amazing team there. So in 1990, what were they saying? Here's a bit of a quote for you. So we can see this emphasis on building a shared understanding, a shared way of reflecting about language, called a meta-language, and this emphasis on making resources visible. And of course, we have a huge body of literature echoing this point. A few references there. And one reason why we care about meta-language so much, and we use words like visible, of course, is connected to our social and particularly our dialogic perspective on the process of learning. And essentially, we argue that development happens from the outside in, that is, through interaction with others. Now, there's many readings of Vygotsky, but Hassan gives us a beautiful one from a social semiotic perspective. And she says, okay, this process called semiotic mediation, what's happening? Something is being mediated. And we have, in our massive theoretical framework, the ability to articulate what is being mediated. We can consider the mediatee and the mediator and the means of mediation. So Hassan argues that from our social semiotic perspective, we can paraphrase semiotic mediation to mean mediation by means of semiosis. And she says by semiosis, we mean all the sign systems. And obviously with our expanding theory, we mean all semiotic resources. And we use them and they basically to change our mental activity. They're abstract tools that change our mental activity. But she pushes us further. It's not just that we can theorize the means of mediation. She draws on Bernstein to say, okay, semiotic mediation may be happening all the time, but when we argue that it's visible, we know that mediation is happening. We're aware of it. Something is being mediated, and we're engaging in some kind of teaching and learning experience. And in my book, I review literature that connects with this really powerful point that Hassan makes and go, okay, this is why we keep banging on about meta-language, because we're saying it's vital. And this is what I argue for making what is being mediated visible. So we cared about it in 1990, and we still care about it now, and probably on my tombstone, there'll be something like believed in meta-language. We place very high value on it. And with our expansive theory, of course, and we saw with Victor Lim this morning, and a quote here from Van Leeuwen, meta-language is not restricted to spoken or written language. And that's in the same for classroom meta-language. And by this, I mean what meanings we create for and with students. And we can think about that multimodally as well. For me, a breakthrough with analyzing classroom discourse has been the recent theorization of paralanguage. I've got some of the really important work there in the bottom corner. And the basic distinction that is made is, can a meaning act independently, or is it dependent? So can it stand alone, or does it need some co-text or co-expression? I think of that as, does it need some mates to be understood? And we can compare the way we understand meanings about numbers expressed graphologically or with gesture. I don't need to say one and gesture at the same time. If someone says how many cookies you like, I can just go. And we can compare the standalone meaning with paralanguage. So with this embodied meaning here, if you went to a coworker or someone around you right now and you went, it'd be very interesting to see what kind of response you'd get. If I walked into the living room and I said to my lovely wife on the couch watching Netflix, and I went, two responses are probably likely. One, she just might blank me. Just go, oh, that's just Lucy being weird again. Or she might prompt me for more meaning and say, what? So the point here is there's meanings that are embodied, and we're going to argue the same for shape and color, that are not standalone and that are in relationship with the cotext. Just to show you what was happening here, there's the embodied activity was actually 2 parts. So it went something like this. And that was timed with the wording of, we could actually split that. So when the teacher says split, we get the embodied activity. So I'll put that together, something like, we could actually split that. Now, when we use the theory of paralanguage, we're able to bring this meaning making with different semiotic resources in precise relationship with each other. And we can say that the paralanguage is ideationally convergent with spoken language. And I've got a few examples in my book where we argue about why concurrence is so powerful. If you have interest in other areas, not just ideational meaning, you can look at convergence. So that should be up at the ideation one. We're looking at ideation today. You could look at resonance, or you could look at synchronicity, but we're focused today on ideational meaning. So I just want to clarify that our interest in concurrence with teaching slides is to think about it as paralanguage. And, we could go down the avenue of looking at color and looking at this full semiotic potential and draw on the work of Van Leeuwen and others. Or we could look at PowerPoint slides as a semiotic artifact and build on the beautiful work by Emilia Jonov and Sun Zhao and others. But we're really interested in how what might be on the slide is brought into relationship with each other, and how we can identify what that is and talk about it. And particularly when we think about what we're doing with students as we build knowledge about language and we're trying to make meaning accessible, we're going to argue that we can use paralanguage to provide linguistic evidence of why classroom metalanguage that we dynamically create with students is so much more than wording. And we're going to draw on the recent work of Zapavinga and Logi with emoji text relations. And we're going to look at their system of concurrence. So they do convergence across metalanguage, across all the meta functions. And with concurrence, they can say, okay, an emoji can contribute meaning more congruently or directly by illustrating something, like I need a coffee, or it can be integrated into text and essentially substitute, give me some, since I'm bored. Now, this is still paralanguage because we need the code text here to understand that we're not talking about brown lentil soup, but rather a cup of coffee. And emojis can also contribute meaning that's less direct or more incongruent. And an example from their data set is you can add meanings that stand for something else. So this one, there might be breakfast, and we have the little emojis of the eggs and the frying pan and the bacon. So that is standing for a broader concept. And for some groups of speakers and discourse communities, these little emojis can have particular meanings that become a bit more stabilized. And an example from their data is this one. So the coffee emoji, but that sounds like something very interesting. And then you have the eyes. And what they explain beautifully is that the coffee here is actually symbolizing spilling the tea, meaning they're having a good gossip. So they're disclosing gossip. So there's different kinds of relationships that the emojis are contributing with the cotext, all theorized as paralanguage. So our starting point is thinking, okay, we've got a concurrent system here for our kinds of data that we're looking at, the teaching slides. And to what extent do these features hold for our data, or where might we need to expand or adapt the system in some way? So just before we get into the examples, just a couple of things to say. One is we really want to acknowledge that there's so many amazing educators within our community that have been doing things with color and shape and image and wording and connecting all of those meanings beautifully in their teaching. That part's not new. What we think is new is having this beautiful theory that can now establish how these choices are brought into relationship with each other and why we care about these choices so much. We'd also like to acknowledge that we very much would like to look at classroom discourse and the slides, of course, working together. But at the moment, we're just going, all right, there's a lot happening on the slides themselves. Let's see how we can understand them. Is there anything else you'd like to add there, Ruth?
No, thanks, Lucy. I think I'm happy to go on to my example.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, let's get into it. So we're each just going to share a small sample from our own teaching, which is our starting point for thinking about this new line of work.
So this example that I'll be showing in a moment, not this slide, the next one, when we get to it, is from an initial teacher education subject I've taught for several years. So just to give you some context, the students are learning to be primary school teachers. In this particular subject, they were learning about language and how it works, including in the kinds of texts such as the narrative picture book that you can see there on this slide, that they might then be using in primary school classrooms. So in the example I'm about to show you, students have previously learned about transitivity, processes, participants, and circumstances. And my next move was to introduce the idea of types of participants, and specifically actor and goal. We glossed actor as doer, using the language of the New South Wales syllabus of the time, and goal as done to. So on this slide here, which was from the lecture, you can see an extract from that picture book from the previous slide from Drac and the Gremlin. The print is shown in different colours. So we have processes in green, participants in red, and circumstances in blue, colours you might recall from Sally Humphrey's plenary earlier in the conference. And I then introduced actors and goals using a triangle for actor or doer and a more rounded shape for goal or done to. Later on, we applied this knowledge to interpreting patterns in the language of narrative genre texts, but in this talk, our focus is on understanding the meta-language itself. So keeping that in focus, we'll move on to the system of concurrence on the next slide. Here, Lucy and I are adapting Zapovinia and Logie's work. We expand their system with the display choice, and this is to account for how colour contributes to meaning. So looking here at the print from that previous slide, the use of the coloured fonts supports students in distinguishing different functional components one from the other. So the different colours show the linguistic components and therefore contribute meaning. If we think about the shapes, the two shapes for actor and goal represent a different kind of meaning. These are metaphors for metalinguistic concepts. The triangle stands for actor with its points, its angularity. This shape represents an entity with the potential to impact other entities. And the curved shape stands for goal with its more benign looking roundness, suggesting an entity being acted upon. I'd just like to briefly unpack the provenance of those particular shapes for actor and goal and perhaps help to contribute to understanding how they work as metaphors. My original use of angular shapes for actor and rounded shapes for goal was in 1994 when I was the classroom teacher of a project that ran in my Year 6 class led by Jeff Williams. And the children created playful clauses like the one that's going to appear on the screen. So you can see they were using the shapes, the angular and the rounded shapes for the different participants. They later applied this knowledge to exploring patterns of actors and goals in a narrative picture book. And then in terms of further provenance, drawing on that 1994 work, John Polius and Brian Dare have adopted the notion of hats. In their work, grade 2 children used a pointy triangular hat for actor and a rounded hat for goal. This evokes not only the meanings about the angularity versus the sort of more rounded benign shape that I've already indicated, but also the metaphor of, at least in English-speaking cultures, of the idea of people wearing different hats, occupying different roles. In this grade 2 class, the children used their meta-linguistic understandings to explore actor and goal, so humorously swapping over coloured cards. So you can imagine the humour of swapping the 2 red cards there. As they thought about the language choices that you might use in crafting clauses and sentences to write in the explanation genre, in this case, explanations about the topic of how milk gets from the farm to the store.
Nice, thank you, Ruth. Yeah, so acknowledging the significant body of work that's behind our investigation here. Shifting context to nursing students doing a research project, often for the first time, and a little snapshot of teaching related to writing the literature review section of a research proposal. And I'll give you a few moments to take in this next example. So the students are learning at this point in time about the textual organization of paragraphs, trying to think about how do we organize things for a reader. They previously learned about claims, and also we call them claim makers here at the source, and thinking about how claims need to be matched with evidence, but a choice in terms of how that unfolds from the reader's perspective. So mapping this onto the system of concurrence, we can see the little graduate image there is illustrating the who, and the co-text tells us that the who is the researcher. Less direct is the idea of a book standing for the what, and the what with the co-text we saw is the claim being made. And also the use of the spotlight to say, hey, this is what is going first. It's been given prominence. Like Ruth's dataset, we see colour being used to distinguish types of language choices or even components within a choice. And this is such a simple point to make because I'm sure many of us are doing this all the time. But what are we doing? We've got a text about, for example, diabetes. So we've got an instance of wording, and colour is drawing attention to types of language choices that could be made again, not just this text, but other texts. So we think about, well, how do we not build a fragmented view of language? You know, we have it in our theory, but what are we doing with our classroom to build an understanding more systematically? And here with distinguish, we're relating instances to types of choices. And when you can do that together, you're able to hold both of those things at the same time. So a simple but a really powerful contribution. But we think colour is doing something more. Another slide. This corresponds to the who and the what organization. But now students are thinking about, okay, we need a consolidating layer as well. So here we've got a gradient of blue, an association being made that, hey, we've got 3 types of choices here that are related to each other. And additionally, there's some metaphoric meanings going on. A claim is related to, you know, the analogy of being like a box. And the details are the things, the concrete details that you pull out and you specify. And then all of that is repacked. So mapped onto the system, we can say that we can also use colour to create a very specific association. And what I think we're doing is we're actually showing the options. We're using colour to show the options in the system. But by system, I don't mean the full system of periodicity or the full system of logico-semantics or engagement. I mean the system that the students are experiencing at that moment in time. So our color is creating parameters for how much of the system we're choosing to bring in and wanting students to think about. So again, how do we build knowledge about language in a systematic way? We think color's making a really important contribution to that. And we saw the metaphor of the box here standing for an entity, but also we can use the metaphor for a sequence when we put it together. So if we come back to Cool, Connie, and the connectives, or the VCOP gang, look, interpersonally, we might be able to investigate whether there is any traction with these kind of colors and figures, perhaps making things more friendly or I don't know, inviting, or is it having some interpersonal appeal? But ideationally, we can say, well, really the choices are quite limited. We're really only using color to distinguish one type of choice from another. And then, as some of you were talking about in chat, yeah, the pyramid, they made me frown. It's like I'm looking at it, I'm frowning, and I'm trying to understand what the relationship is. And I think when we think about concurrence and we think about the potential of semiotic resources to create an association, the problem I have and why I find this troubling is I can't see what that association is. Now, someone had in chat, and Ruth helped me out here to say, yeah, there is something, I think it was Annabelle, there is something going on with frequency, that and is most frequent. But if we follow that logic, what's at the top, at the apex? Sweet, nothing. Right? So that kind of logic falls apart. So it helps us understand and be able to critique the choices that we're making. And look, maybe there's something with the figures that could be, meanings that could be established over time with a particular learning community. There might be some potential here, but essentially we're saying ideationally it's limited. But it's easy to critique other people's resources, isn't it? So let me critique one of mine. So here at this point in time, a little bit further on in the workshop, we're looking at the consolidating claim with my nursing students, but they're writing a literature review. So the point that I'm making with wording and the emphasis in my voice and all the flappy things I might do with my hands is that the whole point of consolidating is that you need to connect to the new research. That's what you need to do in the literature review. But if we critique this and we look at the wording of new research, and we just look at that wording, we go, is there any semiotic resources connecting with new research? There isn't. So ideationally, new research has no mates. So I think, okay, how could I change this? I could distinguish with color, and I could continue the metaphor of the box by perhaps using an arrow and dotted green lines to say, hey, we have got a claim we could make in the future. So concurrence gives us a way to really think about what are we bringing into relationship, and we're able to critique resources. Now, previously, we've cared about what we choose and how we make meaning for a very long time, and bridging meta-language, that notion that Sally mentioned in her plenary, and also Maria Brisk. Yeah, we've been trying to describe what we know teachers do all the time, is that we go elsewhere. We bring in meanings, particularly from everyday settings, and we bring those in to try and make something accessible. And this might be relevant, say, for Victor Lim with some of his wonderings about how do we make things accessible. And maybe it's not just the terms, but what the meanings and the relationships we're bringing together. Just quickly, favorite example of Sally's. Some of you may have seen this before, but she's working with year 8 or 9 boys in this example from our 2016 paper. And these teenage boys are learning to write multi-sided arguments. They need to manage multiple points of view. They're basically learning heteroglossic expansion and contraction. And the bridging meta language that works so well is opening and closing the door. And this happens with verbally in verbiage and with embodied meaning, physically opening and closing the door. And the boys love it. They're able to critique texts. And we've got one amazing example where the boy rolls his eyes back. And in response to what's happening in the text, he says, they've opened the door for 1 hour. You know, too much space for other points of view. But more recently, we've been able to draw on Martin, who's thinking about the movement between fields. So when we think about examples of like bridging meta language, I think what we're actually saying is we have some target discourse, we have some target meanings that we're trying to teach, and we go elsewhere, we go into other fields, we import meanings in order to make the target knowledge accessible. So Jim uses the word dialogic discourse. We're in dialogue with other fields. We bring in those meanings to teach the target field. Now his theorization here, I'll touch on it briefly. He uses a topology to look at the extent that to which discourse is disciplinary discourse and whether it is controlled, like to what extent is it controlled by the knowledge that students need to have and the behavior of schooling. So we can think about discourse along that angle and the intersection then with educational discourse. And that refers to the curriculum genres. To what extent are they organizing and orchestrating the interaction with knowledge itself? So that topology is beautifully explained in Martin's recent chapter. But for us, thinking about paralanguage, we go, okay, now we can go, right, if we're teaching actor and goal, glosses, doers, and done-tos, what's paralanguage doing? We are importing meanings from an everyday field and bringing them into the target discourse to make it accessible. Or my students trying to get an understanding of what the hell is a consolidating claim. We're using association with color and metaphors like the repacking of a box. Those understandings from an everyday field, we are bringing them in, importing them to the target discourse. And that's what we're trying to do to make these new meanings for students accessible and build a shared understanding. So what are we saying? What we really want to argue is we know teachers for many, many years are bringing in meanings from other fields to build knowledge about language with students. That's not new, but ideational convergence or concurrence, it allows us to understand how we import meanings from one field into another. And that's super exciting because we're able to identify where it's happening and thinking about why. And we're doing it for very particular pedagogic purposes with very specific groups of students. So we've been, decades now thinking about meta-language, but we have this new theory that can provide this new insight in terms of how we are trying to make meta-language with our students accessible and build meaning. A couple of closing comments before we have time for questions. So we're just starting our work to build and expand this system. And we think that it gives us really precise linguistic evidence to continue to build the argument that when we're working at the coalface with students, the classroom meta-language that they experience is so much more than wording. So we continue to build that argument, expanding what counts. We also think concurrence is teachable in the way that I was able to critique just lightly the conning the connectives and then my own resource. We're able to look at options taken and not taken to think about, well, what are we doing with shape and color and wording? How are we bringing them into relationship with each other? And this may be relevant to some of you as well. in my work, I'm, going hard out to create PowerPoint slides, but I also need to represent some of those meanings statically on web pages. And, as you're teaching, you're able to do so much with your voice. You've got animation. You can then do things with shape and color and metaphors. There's so many things that can happen dynamically. Web page is static. So I'm going to start to think about, well, what concurrence works on a web page that may not work when I'm teaching, and vice versa. So it gives us a way to thinking about the affordances of different modes in our resources. And then thinking about Gen AI. So in my recent work to customize and design chatbots to give SFL-informed feedback, that's all been very text-focused. Blocky Law gave us a little bit of insight into customizing a chatbot. Essentially, you can write instructions that steer the output of how a GPT behaves. So what a GPT might identify, and also the response. You can try and steer that with instructions, but it's all wording at the moment. But imagine if you design a slide deck, you've created beautiful concurrence, you've really thought about meanings that are going together. Students have experienced it with you in a class, and they've been able to build a shared understanding, and then you can have that continuity of meta language where an output from a GPT might not just be text. You might be able to have that association of colors and so forth. And that would be really exciting. So we'd like to just finish there so we have enough time to connect with you. Please also reach out through email. We would love to hear any thoughts you might have. So thank you, and we'll open to questions. And if anybody wants references, please let me know. I can send them to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have rounds of applause virtually. As Lucy asked, any questions? We have lots of positive comments, both towards the general conference and specifically to this, for example, from Peter McKinday about learning about how the way you've woven a number of affordances as resources for making meaning, indeed multimodal affordances employed, are overwhelming, positively in brackets and parentheses. Anything else? And again, please unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Oh, hi, I'll just jump in. I don't like silences after talks. That was brilliant, both of you. And I love the perspectives that you're bringing from the big text making academic kind of work and the play aspect at the younger years. I was just, thinking with the red, green and blue colouring of transitivity groups. I remember a year 2, student in Queensland telling me they're green, the processes are green because a clause won't go without a process. So that whole metaphor going along with the colour is another kind of convergence, I think.
Absolutely.
And your comment for me resonates with drawing out the meta language from students. A clause won't go without green. That's brilliant. And I had just last week having a chat with a PhD student and trying to make this point about what the consolidating claim is doing in a literature review. And I always try to give students time to reflect and try to let it resonate and create the meta language that might stick for them. And he said something like, okay, I get it. In a lit review, you don't just document what's there, you harness it. So I talked about connecting it to the new, and he talked about it as harnessing. And I thought that was just a brilliant way to put it. And it's a way that, resonated with him.
It's one of the year 2 students in my PhD research when we were talking about theme. We were talking about setting up the sentence in the way it's going to go. She said, it's like when you kick off at football. work out which way you're facing. And so, yeah, inviting the children to come up with metaphors is very illuminating, actually. You learn from them. Also, if they've misunderstood something, I imagine.
Okay, we have a question here from Jennifer Walsh. Jennifer, do you want to unmute and ask directly?
Sure, but then I would lose the sunglass emoji that I use to supplement my meaning. But
Sorry.
so that's fine. You mentioned that the high school boys and the opening and closing of doors for expanding and contracting the discursive space. And I think many of us were madly taking notes because that will be incorporating that into our teaching tomorrow. But I'm also wondering, so then if you're looking at other audience specific or discipline specific convergences. So I saw the boxes, great, and it's generic but I'm, you also talked about working with nurses. I'm working with engineers. Like, are there other examples that you've come across or thought of, or that others here might, that really do resonate with those specific disciplines or communities that we're working with?
Yeah, I think it's a great question to ask. And I think now that I'm finally getting to looking at slides, which have been on my mind for some time, and now that I can actually understand it as, oh, it's ideational convergence that I'm using, that's how I'm trying to make it accessible. Now that I can articulate that, I think I could turn to a nursing colleague and say, okay, so can we ditch the box idea? Can we bring in another metaphor that might be help them, and again, as you say, relate more to their discipline and their context. So I think now that I know what I'm trying to do and we have a way to talk about it, I can have that conversation.
Yeah, I would just add that it will depend on your audience, definitely. I agree with that, because with the teacher education examples, I'm thinking these might be things they would use in the classroom, but also because we want something like actors and goals to be something that they would be able to identify in different kinds of texts. We want something that's suitably abstract. So not something that looks like a real actor in some kind of way, that's something that evokes that idea. There's some dimension of the shape that suggests that it might impinge upon or impact upon something else. But once it becomes more specific, it perhaps also then narrows or reduces the abstraction and makes it less useful.
Fair. Yeah.
And Millie says, unlike Connie. Yeah.
Annabelle has a question, I think.
Yes.
Thanks so much. You gave examples from a quite different context. So some from primary school classrooms and then some from, teaching sort of in an academic literacy environment. I just wondered if either of you have had much experience teaching grammar at university, and how much of what you're talking about you feel is relevant specifically in that context. And I confess I've done a lot of teaching of grammar at university, and I haven't really thought through any of the things you've been talking about today. And so, yeah, I just wanted to throw that question to you.
Ruth.
My experience is only in teaching in teacher education. So it's grammar for classroom purposes, and typically 3 to 4 weeks of 1 10-week semester only. So it's about getting a certain amount in a short space of time. The particular subject I was talking about, we did assume that the students had learnt some of that in subsequent subjects, although I would argue that it was probably fairly tentative knowledge, insecure knowledge. And also that there wasn't time to additionally teach how to teach grammar in the classroom. So there's this whole thing in teacher education about how the way you teach it needs to model the way it might be done in the classroom. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that teachers put up lots of PowerPoint presentations and talk to them, but the use of the colours and shapes was meant to both model as well as introduce the knowledge about language. But absolutely, it's a really good question to be asking, and I'd love to have the luxury of having more time to spend with some of those students.
Thank you.
But I having taught like grammar for grammar's sake, in a sense, for many, many years, I it's always about meaning. We're always teaching grammar in the context of a text or a meaning unit. So I can't see how it can't, I think it would be just as relevant. And I certainly feel like I use all these convergences all the time without, really knowing what I'm doing, and that's really wonderful. But I can't see the difference in a sense.
There would be differences in one sense that I feel as though from a Vygotskian perspective, once you start to see things through a certain lens, it might then make it more difficult to see it through a different lens. So if you colour all processes green, then how do you then get people to start thinking about different kinds of processes and patterns of different kinds of processes across the text? So there might be a shift to mental processes, for example. So so that would be a caveat I would sort of put on it, that you and so with the Year 6 class, we actually introduced different shapes for different process types, and the students came up with them. They came up with various metaphors. They drew pictures of things like an extension cord clicking into another chord. So the idea of conjunctions between and chain links for relational processes.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I didn't mean you'd use the same metaphors or the
No,
same kind of elements, ideational meanings, but that you would, that I can't see how they would be, how the notion, the systems would be less relevant.
Mm.
Okay, unfortunately, I'm going to have to bring this session to a close because it's past 45 past, and we have another session to get into. But I want to say thank you very much for this talk. We did have a comment in the chat from Amelia that Ruth does an amazing job in teaching transitivity, mood, theme, and more, including visual grammar in 4 weeks. So, Ruth, share that with us. Okay, perhaps your next
Thanks, everyone.
presentation.
Thanks,
Okay.
Lucy.
Anyway, thank you very much. I have a question I'm going to ask you all later regarding the relation of this to LCT autonomy, because I couldn't help but keep on hearing that, but I'll ask that later. Anyway, thank you so much, Vin.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Thanks so much again, Lucy and Ruth, for your wonderful speech. So, and everyone for your question and comment. That's really great. So now I'm opening up 3 record room. We had 3 record room this afternoon, everyone. Recreate room, 3 let participant 2 room. Yep. Okay. All rooms are open. I'll see you. We will see you in the record room. Where Eric? Okay.